The distance between my head and the frame was apparently too high in the previous podcast. Some aesthetics people are always commenting. Of course, they are friends, they mean well, and I'm not paying attention to all those things all the time. So I'm sure you are only paying attention to the content, so you don't care either. Either way, I do this sitting in my apartment and sometimes in the office, so it's not a professional production or anything. Okay, so what is the policy toolkit for CCUS? IEA provides the policy approaches for CCUS deployment, and the next one is policy toolkit to address CCUS challenges. There is no one single approach to building a commercial market for CCUS. Various approaches should be thought of as existing on a spectrum. Incentive or penalty based, so bottom up or top down kind of approach, market forces versus regulation based, shared cost allocation, and full control approach. Institutional, economic, and political factors will influence what part of the CCUS policy spectrum a country may end up on, and countries may move along the spectrum as these factors change and as the domestic market for CCUS matures. Where a country sits on where a country sits on the spectrum may impact the types of policy tools that it chooses to use. So here are the approaches. You have low intervention, and then depends on how cost is shared, and then you have high intervention or strict regulatory requirements for the market. Incentive or penalty based approach, policies to influence how a private company will make its investment decisions. This is either done with the incentives such as grants, loans, or tax credits to private companies to deploy a certain technology or adopt a certain policy or practice, or with penalties such as taxes and fees for not complying with regulations, but interventions are still low. In the shared cost allocation approach, economic parameters govern the cost and revenue structure of a company, which is shared between the public and private sectors. This approach may be well suited for large infrastructure endeavors such as the development of a CO2 transportation and storage network. So there will be some public-private partnership, basically because even if a private company exists, it cannot start storing CO2 wherever it wants. There will be scientific requirements on long-term storage and technical requirements of ensuring no leakage happens, no other side effects happen, such as polluting water resources, etc. Full control approach, instead of solely relying on the private sector to develop a market, this approach leans on state-owned enterprises to finance, build, own, and operate projects. It may still rely on some level of private sector involvement, whether it's through jointly developing projects as a customer or as an investor. This is common where government funds a lot of the infrastructure, but private contractors build most of the things, and then there are shared responsibilities, so acceptable risks and unacceptable risks and so on. I discuss more of that in the adaptation sustainability courses that you can follow up. Next up, policy toolkit to address CCUS challenges. Governments have several policy tools to address challenges to CCUS deployment. It is important that these tools work together to tackle economic viability, lead time, innovation, and complexity challenges. Whatever tools a government chooses to employ will be unique to that country, but it is vital that the tools are effective and efficient, setting up a viable and sustainable commercial market for CCUS that attracts investment and retains it over the long term. Okay, so high intervention by the government and government investments also need sustaining it in mainstreaming the budget processes, fiscal policies, and so on. So revenue models still have to be in place, whether it's just through taxes or some other mechanism. The challenges: economic viability, lead times, innovation gaps, and project complexity. So here, policy tools for meeting these challenges. For example, absent any policy support, the economic viability of a CCUS project is a major barrier to wide-scale deployment. So you can have grants, tax credits, loans, state-owned enterprises to meet the economic viability challenge. Again, needs a revenue model. Carbon pricing and leakage policy, public procurement, low emission mandates, carbon contracts for difference, regulated asset base, emerging market and developing economy considerations, so concessional finance, sustainable debt, multilateral funding, investment instruments, and so on. For lead times, what do we mean? Total time required between a project's conception and commissioning currently is around 6 years, but reaching net zero goals hinges on cutting these lead times significantly. So here, one-stop shop for permitting, so that companies are not running around amid bureaucracy, clear approval timelines, internal regulatory capacity, pre-competitive resource assessment, data sharing and transparency, community engagement requirements. You can't go and put CCUS in neighborhoods. Already happens with power plants and wastewater treatment and so on. So community engagement requirements have to be clearly defined as well. Otherwise, you start a project and you will get stuck with protests and opposition. Innovation gaps. Technology maturity varies considerably, and to meet that, you may need research, development, and demonstration platforms for international cooperation, so that you don't have to do everything from scratch. For indirect investment for technology co-development, so that again you skip parts of the research and development and just import what is necessary. Project complexity, of course. Shift to a hub model means a complex project structure with implications for risk, timing, and coordination. So you need long-term liability legislation, competitive solicitations for hubs, one-off backstop agreements for first movers, so don't worry about the details if you don't understand. London Protocol specifications is a framework that is in the report. I'm not going to include it, but you can go and follow up. Definition of high quality removals. You know, if we are removing CO2, what is the energy cost versus carbon cost per ton of removal, and so on. So high quality removals are necessary, but you have to define what they mean. And monitoring, reporting, and verification mechanisms are always critical, because you cannot be churning along saying we are doing CDR, but you have to show it's actually happening. Just in terms of capacity of current and planned large-scale CO2 capture and storage projects versus what is needed by 2050 for net zero emission scenario. So going from 2022 to 2030 in terms of millions of tons of CO2 per year, so that's not a huge number. You know, you're barely getting up to 1 gigaton here. So you have operating, under construction, advanced development, concept and feasibility, gap to net zero emission storage and utilization. Both are fairly large. In fact, larger than what is already here in terms of these items here. So capture and storage, where you need to keep ramping up, and where you will be in terms of gaps in capture and storage or utilization and storage by 2030 with the current pace. Okay, so operating and planned CO2 capture capacity by application, Q2 of 2023 versus what is expected by 2030. So share of capacity right now, operating is mostly for natural gas processing, with other items here in terms of biofuels, power and heat, iron and steel, direct air capture, merchant hydrogen and, or ammonia, other fuel transformation, cement and other industries. So by 2030 you want to have all of them be significant parts of operation and CO2 capture. Okay, obviously I'm skipping the details, but the idea is right now everything is dominated by natural gas processing, kind of a low-hanging fruit, cost effective, but all these things, cement and merchant hydrogen and ammonia, have to ramp up to reach the NZE goals by 2050. Okay, Current policy mechanisms for CCUS, I won't read the details, but categories are enabling legislation and rules, cost reduction measures, regulation of industrial activities, strategic signaling, where government can send strategic signals that work to incentivize long-term investment in CCUS projects so that private investors feel confident about making investments. Revenue support, of course, this is always essential in such a new field. Key elements of a CCUS business model: project type. We already talked about full chain, part chain, but there are also self-capture with third-party CO2 offtake, so that you have a point source where you do your capture and somebody else takes it away for utilization elsewhere, or CO2 transport and storage as a service, so that this is the offtake part here, and capture itself as a service. Ownership can be public, private, or public-private partnership. Economic rationale can be public sources, grants, tax credits, etc. that we talked about. Carbon pricing is included here. Public procurement of low emission products, so you incentivize people and firms to also rely on low emission products. And there is also extended product responsibility that manufacturers can use on a kind of a circular economy approach. Public procurement of carbon dioxide removal services. Communities can own these things, just like many communities own renewable energy plants. Private sources, of course, direct use of CO2, low emission products, voluntary carbon markets, and so on. Of course, there are lots of challenges: high capital and operating costs, long project lead times, project complexity that we already talked about, innovation gaps, coordination among various steps and players, cross-border transports have to be legally worked out, policy uncertainty can spook investors and communities, public awareness and acceptance is needed, otherwise you will face opposition and suspicion. Availability of finance, always critical. Risk management and insurance, so that unintended consequences are protected in terms of risks. Stakeholders can be governments, policymakers, regulators, including permitting, private sector, so project investors, owners, developers, operators, supply chain contributors, and civil society and the public. How long is this podcast? This is a nice package that we can leave together, 12.5 minutes. So we'll come back and conclude. Just 2 slides left, so definitely we'll conclude and we'll look at whether EOR is a good revenue stream for CCUS, and policy tools to address the challenges of CCUS deployment. Right? You may have a technology that is research developed, technology readiness is high, but deployment can depend on many barriers. So that has to be addressed as well in terms of policies. Okay, see you in the last podcast.